Hello, welcome to another Mortgages Made Simple. Today we're discussing understanding seller-paid closing costs. Hello, I'm John Thomas with Primary Residential Mortgage, here to cover this topic with you. So there's a lot of confusion around seller-paid closing costs, so I want to clear that up. Seller-paid closing costs are negotiated between the home buyer and the home seller during the initial offer process and are actually written into the sales agreement themselves. So seller-paid closing costs are also sometimes called seller assistance. It's the same thing. If the seller-paid closing costs are not written into the contract, then they don't exist and they will not be credited to the buyer at the settlement table. So if you verbally discuss seller-paid closing costs, but it's not actually written into the contract, or you thought you were getting seller-paid closing costs and it's not written into the contract, then you're not getting it. It will not be credited to you closing, and you will have to come up with that money. If you need to get pre-approved for a mortgage, or you have any questions or concerns, you can give us a call at 302-703-0727 or online, DelawareMortgageLoans.net. Now, it's very important to understand when you ask the seller to pay your closing costs, that money is coming out of the seller's pocket at closing and going towards your closing costs. So if you're offering them $200,000 to buy their home and asking them to pay $10,000 towards your closing costs, you're not really offering that seller $200,000, because at closing you're going to pay them $200,000, but then they're going to give you back $10,000 towards your closing costs. So the seller is really only netting $190,000. So your offer to the seller looks like a $190,000 offer, not a $200,000 offer, because you're subtracting off $10,000. So this is important to understand. So if you have a house listed at $210 and you offer them $200 and then also ask for $10,000 in seller paid closing costs, you're really dropping the price $20,000, because instead of the seller netting the $210 they were asking for, they're only netting the $190 after you drop the price $10 for a $200 offer and then drop it again by asking for $10,000 back. So you've got to understand how these dynamics work when you're talking about seller paid closing costs. Now, another big question we get is, who negotiates the seller-paid closing costs? This is a great question. The seller-paid closing costs are usually negotiated by your real estate agent, your buyer's agent, if you have one. The only time they would not be negotiated by the buyer's agent is if you're representing yourself. So when the offer is submitted to the seller's agent, you need to write that seller-paid closing costs into the contract. So again, if you were offering $200,000 and asking for $10,000 back, that $10,000 is written into the contract. There's a spot for that. It's very important that you, your agent, and your lender are all on the same page when submitting an offer, so that everyone understands what the mortgage payment's going to be, and more importantly, what the cash to close is going to be for the home buyer. So if your lender approves you for $200,000 with $10,000 in seller paid closing costs, but you only submit an offer with your agent for $200,000 with 3% seller paid closing costs, you're only asking for $6,000, but prior to that, your lender ran the numbers with you asking for $10,000. So you can't be thinking you're going to have the same cash to close from the pre-approval when you change the terms of your offer, because in reality, you're going to be now short $4,000 if you weren't aware of that change. Because instead of asking for $10,000, if you ask for 3%, that's only $6,000 on a $200,000 purchase. So now you're going to be coming up with an extra $4,000 at closing than when the lender ran the number. So if you're going to change the numbers on an offer, you need to go back to the lender and have them rerun the numbers, so that you, your buyer's agent, and the lender are all on the same page with what you're asking for and what your cash to close is going to be, and also what's your payment going to be monthly, because rates can change every day. So you want to make sure if the rate has changed, you're still okay with the payment. So that's why we, Primary Residential Mortgage, always recommend, hey, if you're looking at a property, send it to us, let us run the numbers, let us talk to you or discuss what your offer is going to be. Make sure you understand the cash to close, the monthly payment. If you get a counter back from the seller, get back to us. We'll rerun the numbers to make sure you're on the same page. Now, how much seller paid closing costs can you get? This is a great question, because it actually can change based on the loan type you're pre-approved for, and even how much money you're putting down towards the deposit, towards the down payment on a purchase. So if we look at an FHA loan and an FHA 203K rehab loan, the seller can pay up to 6% of the purchase price. So on a $100,000 purchase, you can get up to $6,000 towards your closing costs and prepaid items, no more. On a VA loan, there's some confusion around this. People think it's 4%. It's not actually 4%. The seller can pay all customary closing costs and up to 4% for discount points to buy your rate down and paying down the buyer's debt to help them qualify. So that's where that 4% caps come in. There's actually no cap on customary closing costs. Now, USDA loans will allow up to 6% towards the purchase price, just like FHA. Conventional loans, it's tiered based on your down payment. If you're putting down less than 10% towards the purchase price, you're capped at only 3% seller paid closing costs. So that's a big difference between FHA, USDA, VA, and conventional. Is with less than 10% down, the closing cost can be half of what you can ask for. Now, if you put 10 to 25% down, then you can ask for the 6% that matches FHA. But if you put more than 25% down, you can actually ask for up to 9%. Not sure you're going to get 9% from the seller, but you could ask for it. Now, when do I get the closing costs paid by the seller? I get this question a lot. No, the seller's not actually going to write you a check. It's all done at closing by the settlement agent, and it's done on the closing disclosure. So when you negotiate on the sales contract, it's never given directly to the buyer. It's just a line item on the closing disclosure, and it actually shows up typically as a line item to the buyer on page 3 of the closing disclosure. It'll be a debit on the seller side and a credit to the buyer side. There's an example on the screen. If you look at that, you can see there's a seller credit there to the buyer, $2,500, and then on the seller side, it's a debit of $2,500, which comes out of their net. So that's where the seller paid closing costs typically show up on a transaction. Now, sometimes for like on a VA loan, if there's some not allowable VA fees, what they can do is take the fees and actually move them from the buyer side on page 2 of your closing disclosure to the seller side. So they don't actually show up on the buyer side, and the title company would add up all the fees you moved to the seller side to tell you how much seller paid closing costs you got that way. So that's another way to do it. It's a little more confusing for the buyer because they don't see a line item for it. It's actually, the fees are actually moved from the buyer side to the seller side in the closing disclosure. But that's the 2 ways that you actually get the seller paid closing costs. And what that means is if you've negotiated more money from the seller than there are actual closing costs to pay, you as the buyer lose the money and the seller gets to keep it. So if you negotiate $10,000 on a $200,000 purchase from the seller towards your closing costs, and you only have $8,000 in closing costs at closing, the extra $2,000 the buyer loses. They can't get it, and the seller just gets to net an extra $2,000 on the closing disclosure. Now, does the seller pay the closing costs out of pocket? No, we just discussed that. They do not actually write a check to the buyer. It's just a debit on the closing disclosure, so it's more of just a math problem. At closing, the seller walks away with just a proceeds check, and the buyer just brings one check made payable to the attorney, and that's how all the numbers work out. Now, what happens if there's not enough closing costs to be used by the seller? Just discuss that. That's another big question. Basically, the seller gets to keep it. If the buyer can't use it because there's not enough closing costs, the seller gets to keep it. That's why you want to make sure when you're making the offer, you understand what the closing costs are going to be so you don't ask for too much. Now, some of the things, if it comes up you're like $500 short of using all the seller paid closing costs, a good technique so you don't lose it as the buyer is to throw the home warranty in to the mix, and then the seller can pay the home warranty so you don't lose the closing costs. So if you have any questions around seller paid closing costs, if you need to get pre-approved for a mortgage to buy a home, we can close you in less than 30 days. Give us a call in the office, 302-703-0727, or you can go online, DelawareMortgageLoans.net. More information there. We have weekly updates, and you can apply right online. Look forward to seeing you guys on the next update.